right, guys. Well, welcome tonight. We have an amazing guest joining us today, Jared Towers from Bay Cetology. Jared's an amazing researcher up north, does a lot of great work, and we're thrilled to have you on, Jared. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to chat with you guys.
That's great to chat with you, Jared. So I'm going to just jump in really quickly. We'll tell a quick story. So the last episode when we talked about our winter travels and winter whales, I forgot to mention one of the stories. And Jared, you were with us down in Cabo. And one of the coolest experiences that we had down there was we were sailing towards Cabo. I don't know, we were maybe 10 or so miles away. And it was really late in the day, and we came across a mom and calf. And it turns out, I think that it was probably, I mean, when I say newborn, I mean, we were talking, it may have been maybe an hour at the most. Really like very foldy and wrinkly, not coming up to the surface on its own, being lifted up by mom. And mom had some suitors nearby.
Yeah, she certainly did. There was a lot of splashing going on, and you know, like you said, that calf was just so apparently new. You know, it seemed to have a hard time surfacing, and perhaps not a hard time, but just that it was very new to it. You know, the way it was coming out of the water, mom was helping it at times. Its fluke was curled over on the tip still. Yeah, it was an amazing sight to see that. But with all those escorts circling around the mom and calf, that was something else altogether.
It was really cool. And then you got some drone footage, and we'll try and post some of that in the show notes. It was really cool that mom wanted nothing to do with the male escorts. She was busy with her calf, and she had her pec fins completely extended for a while. That was pretty cool. And I think by the end, it seemed like the calf was kind of getting the hang of it. One of the things that I vividly remember when we first came on scene there, I wasn't sure if that calf was alive because it would surface and you couldn't really hear the exhales. And then by the time we left, maybe an hour or so later, not only was the calf starting to swim on its own, but when it would come up to the surface, you could clearly hear exhales going.
Yeah, seeing it from above with the drone was something else. I was somewhat in awe, and then Trip got his drone up and flew over them as well before we left. And you're right. I mean, that pec was fully extended, and just seeing the vigor with which those presumed males approached the mom and calf was awesome. It was also a bit terrifying, thinking, how is this mother balancing these pressures, the pressures of being a new mom, looking after this kid, and also having to deal with these other animals? There's this brief period of fertility after most mammals give birth, and that's quite likely what those other whales were interested in. And then once lactational amenorrhea kicks in, it kind of goes away when she starts nursing. So there's just a brief window there, and I was surprised to see that. I don't know if any of us had really seen anything like that before. I think it was new for all of us. Jeff, I know you spent some time with humpback whales at lower latitudes, but you were even saying, seeing these big groups like that chasing each other around wasn't something you've seen, with such large groups of animals.
Yeah, we had that competitive rowdy group a few days prior to the seeing the newborn, and I had never seen. I mean, there were well over a dozen animals in that group. I'd never seen a group that large. Pursuing a female, and I've seen very recently born calves in the Silverbank, but never anything that brand new that was so clearly, an hour or less, or maybe at the most a couple hours. I've never seen a newborn that young. It was really incredible.
Yeah, I was trying to, get some context for it after I got home, because I was thinking, are we right to think that this is what was going on? And fortunately, I found a couple papers by Nico Ransom, published in Marine Mammal Science recently, and Yeah, exactly. This kind of stuff has been seen before in Mexico and in other places around the world where humpbacks breed and mate and calve. And yeah, it's not uncommon for the groups of males to get really aggressive with the mom and calf. And there's even been a few calves showed up dead, and it was presumed that they died from aggressive interactions with these males. In fact, there was even just a few years ago off mainland Mexico, a calf that was hanging out with its mom, a fresh calf, and a bunch of escorts. And people observed that calf getting killed because one of the adults breached on top of it. And that was the end of it.
Wow.
So, yeah, it can be a lot worse. I was hoping that we'd find that group the next day and just verify what had happened to them. But we couldn't find them. They were out there somewhere, though.
Yeah, so many humpbacks. We were never found them again. And we'll have to head back down there and find the killer whales next time.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's a good transition into what you're working on, and you're up in Alert Bay and you run Bay Cetology. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. Home of the killer whale, Alert Bay, traditional territory of the Nungies First Nation. Yeah, so Bay Cetology is a small organization that we incorporated in 2019. I've got a small office here in Alert Bay. Throughout the 2010s, I was mostly involved in three other organizations. A lot of the work that I do and did at that time as well was through Fisheries and Oceans Canada as a cetacean research technician. But I was also a founder of the Marine Education and Research Society and a founder of NMSA, Northumberland Marine Mammal Stewardship Association, and executive director for some time. What I found myself doing, though, is I was on all these research trips, and a lot of the focus was on species or in parts of the world where none of these other organizations could be used as an organization to represent the work I was doing. DFO, for example, has no authority outside of Canada. MERS and NIMS are very British Columbia based. So it made sense to have another organization to house some of the work that I was doing under, and also just provide opportunities for further work, outside of the purview of these other groups. And so, yeah, Bay Cetology came about. And yeah, since then we've been really busy. It's been a great little journey the last 4 years.
Yeah, it's been great following along and just seeing everything you guys are doing. I always look forward to the updates you guys have online and seeing what's going on, for sure.
Yeah, and we're very dependent on your on your several times a year published updates to the BIGS ID catalogs.
Yeah, well, same. I mean, there's so many changes happening so quickly in that population right now. We're overdue for an update. I'm hoping to get it out this week, but the challenge so far has been that there's new calves in a couple of groups, and we're just not sure who they belong to. I mean, one is in the 68Cs, and there's definitely a new kid in there. I don't know if it's belonging to 68C or C1 or what. So we're going to have to wait for another encounter. And then the 46Bs showed up with a new one, and maybe it belongs to 46B, maybe it belongs to 46B3. I think we're going to need another encounter or two to figure that one out. So, and then we've got a number of other calves, like I think 69A6 is in there, and a couple more that we've got to include. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll get that out soon. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, that's great. I just finished updating all of our catalogs for the boats here, so I'll look forward to updating them again shortly. And today, actually, we had the first episode of Cetacean Sessions, and it was amazing. And you are involved with that, right? You hosted it last year. It sounds like whale scientists are hosting it this season. But yeah, it's a really great resource for people to tune into, and it's free.
Yeah, it's you're right. It's free. Why not check it out?
Free and great information.
Yeah, Cetacean Sessions was kind of a pandemic baby. I had a paper published on this. This is a whole other story. I won't get into too much, but while I was down working in the South Atlantic one year, I I documented all these giant petrels preying on live sperm whales, and got in touch with a friend of mine in the Indian Ocean and a colleague, and he got me in touch with another colleague who manages some fisheries observations data in that part of the world, and they had seen the same thing. So we got together, we published this paper in Polar Biology about this unique behavior, because there's really, at that time, there was only one other similar case known in the world where these kelp gulls attack right whales off Argentina. And since then, it's been observed once, or a few times actually, in Australia with silver gulls and humpback whales. But really unique kind of predation events. And I got asked to go on this series called Seabird Sessions, which was like a Zoom meeting just to discuss new papers on seabirds. And Gary and I were talking about it, and we're like, we should do something similar with cetaceans. There's so much good cetacean science coming out. There's so many people interested in it. Crowdcast is such a good platform. And so we did a couple seasons, had a number of awesome guests, and then Gary Sutton and I and the rest of the team as well that helped make that whole series possible. Tasley and Elisan, we're all going in all these directions right now and have got a lot going on. So we got in touch with our colleagues at Whale Scientists, and they were really happy to put the third season together. And today was the first episode of the third season, and it was awesome. A great session.
That's fantastic, and we'll post some information in our show notes on the After the Breach podcast website so that people can get links for that.
Yeah, it's just such a great resource. So many people are interested and maybe not like as involved in the whale community as we are. And so having like these kind of unique topics to like listen into every once in a while or regularly for several seasons is an awesome resource for them. And for us too. I learned a lot today. So
yeah, me too.
And then you also have a Patreon site. Is that right, Jared? So one of the things we like to do is connect our listeners to our guests and find out ways that they can help support the research that you're doing and that. So do you have a Patreon, or is there a way that they can support Bay Cetology?
Yeah. Thank you both. Like I said, we've got a lot of stuff happening, and we have a website, that anyone can go to and see some of the projects we're working on right now. It's baycetology.org. And a couple of the main projects, we do a lot of field work. We're also doing a lot of office work, working on different projects between our students and staff. We also build tools for use by field researchers as well as the general public, people who are interested in whales, whale watchers. We have developed a Northern Resident Killer Whale ID app. We're also working on an open access big killer whale database we can talk about a little bit later maybe. But for anybody who's really interested in supporting this work, we can go on baycetology.org and accept donations there through PayPal. And there's also a Patreon account that I set up recently, which I've been having a lot of fun with. I've been posting so much content there because, I find Facebook is great, Instagram, Twitter, but, Patreon, we don't have a lot of patrons at the moment, but I just feel a lot freer to share our content there because it's a closed system. Naturally, because we're on the water, 2 or 3 times a week, working under permit, collecting photographs and drone video, occasionally underwater video, not only in BC, but also in different countries. It's really easy to put a lot of that content up there. And so we have 4 different tiers. People for $5 a month, they can sign up and get encounter summaries and photos from our noteworthy encounters. For $10 a month, they have access to the same, plus our underwater and aerial footage from our events. And I just posted one today, actually, from an encounter 2 days ago, and it was remarkable. I mean, having that aerial perspective is so amazing to be able to see things that you think are probably happening, and you have thought have probably been happening for a long time, but never really known for sure. And then you get an eye in the sky, and it all becomes clear. I watched killer whales chase sea lions lots of times, but I've always thought that these animals use the seafloor to their advantage to try and escape the whales at times. In this case, there was a group of sea lions, and they actually came over to the killer whales along the seafloor, and you could see this happening with the drone. I think because they wanted to check and see where the killer whales were, and then of course when the killer whales saw them down there, they started following them along, and it's a remarkable game of cat and mouse. It took 3 hours and eventually ended in the death of one of the sea lions, but the other 5 got away.
Wow,
and you can see that
that's crazy
in the video.
That sounds
the
unbelievable.
Other 2, yeah, it was pretty crazy. The other 2 tiers are one for $25 a month, where people get access to everything, as well as some insider information on some of the projects we're working on, upcoming papers, and some of the questions, some of our field work, and data curation, raise potential projects for the future. And our top tier, we only have a few spaces, and only a couple spaces left at our top tier, is $100 a month, and those people are just very generally supportive of our work and are able to join us in the field virtually or in person at least once a year. So yeah, it's been fun. We're building Patreon up and enjoying it as we go.
Awesome.
That sounds amazing.
Well, we'll put some links in our show notes so people can find that more easily.
All right.
Right from there. But yeah, well, moving on, if you don't mind, tell us a bit about yourself, and before we dive into this awesome topic that we have talking about type D killer whales. But yeah, just a little bit about yourself would be great. How'd you get hooked on the whales? It's like a drug.
Well, yeah, it happened pretty young for me. My parents, my dad and my stepmom owned a whale watching company up here in Alert Bay since 1986, and I think it was one of the first whale watching companies in Canada. And yeah, they still have the sailboat. They don't use it for whale watching anymore, but it was a 44-foot sailboat, and I just go along with them every day. We had day trips. They'd make food on board, and we'd sail and look at whales and porpoises and eagles and stuff. So yeah, I just kind of fell in love with the natural world, and the water, working on the water. There's also a culture of research in this area. I mean, Orca Lab isn't too far away, and there's a lot of others, doing research for the government or, for their own personal projects for university or a variety of other things in this area. It was kind of a mecca for killer whale research back in the 80s and 90s, and still is, and even the 70s. But yeah, in 1987, Mike Big had just finished publishing his first killer whale photo ID catalog. And so as a young kid, I was, using that book. And then when John made another edition of it in 1994, John Ford and some of the same other authors, we were all very excited about that. And then again in 2000. And, and as you both know, when you spend time on water, you get to know the animals really well, and their lives just become so fascinating. So following the lives of certain families over multiple generations has been amazing. And I guess, I don't really know anything else, having spent my entire life, just doing this kind of work. It's just been what I've been interested in, what I've been doing. So, yeah.
What an incredible way to grow up, and what an incredible area to grow up in. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen on Earth, up in Johnstone Strait and Alert Bay. Just absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a special spot for sure. There's nothing quite like it.
So before we jump into the type Ds, and this might be the harder question for you than any of the guests we've ever had on here. We always like to ask people if they have a favorite or most memorable encounter that jumps out to them. I mean, obviously there's those of us who are on the water, there's never just one, but we always like to ask our guests if there's a special encounter they want to share.
And
it could be from anywhere.
Yeah, gosh, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to filter that. I could give you 3. Yeah. Sometimes it's more about the journey than the actual encounter itself. And I've had a few epic journeys, and when you finally find what you're looking for, it's really hard not to enjoy that deeply after you've been through a lot to get there. And I can think of a few interesting cases. One after spending a long time, getting down to the southern tip of South America, and then spending several weeks at sea, getting down to Antarctica, and finally finding some killer whales, and finding them doing interesting stuff. That's been pretty amazing when that's happened once or twice. But closer to home, I mean, we had an epic journey trying to find a right whale a couple of years ago.
Wow.
We had a lot riding on this field trip. It was the first of its kind that we had ever put together, and we were really going off of limited information. We just looked at whaling data and the other 4 encounters of right whales in Western Canada since 1951, and most of them were in the spring off the west side of Haida Gwaii. So we went up there, and on our second to last day, we found one after putting I think close to 2,000 miles under the keel.
Wow.
At about 20 to 30 knots, just looking around, going way offshore and up and down the west side. And so that was pretty epic. But yeah, if we're going to talk about Type D, I can't forget that either, because that was something else. I think if we just went out and found Type Ds, it would have been one thing. But we went through a lot just to find those whales, and it was getting down to the wire. We were all feeling pretty beat down, and we had 1 day left, and we beat our way out there, and they were waiting there for us. It was amazing.
That's incredible. And we talked last week on our episode with David, who goes down to Antarctica in the winter, about the seas that you have to go through, and I can't imagine how long. So let's get into the Type Ds. Kind of segue through your journey down there. What are the conditions like? We're in roaring 40s and
mm-hmm.
I can't remember what the 50s are called.
Furious 50s.
Furious 50s, yeah.
Yeah. It's something else for sure. I mean, probably the worst seas I've ever seen is being off Cape Horn. And, thankfully on this Type D trip, we didn't get into seas like that, but because we were in a smaller vessel, we were in a 75-foot sailboat.
Wow.
Even when it was blowing 25, 35 knots, we had to go, we had to make it work, because that was about as low as it got. And, with winds like that, you're dealing with 3-4 meter seas plus a lot of chop on top. And then, it picks up a bit more, and you got to run and hide. I mean, there's this little island kind of southwest of Cape Horn called Isla Diego Ramirez. And we had beat our way out there, not specifically to this island, but there's a drop off west of that island where it goes from relatively shallow, just several hundred feet, to several thousand feet really quickly. And that's kind of a popular edge for Patagonian toothfish longliners. And some of those boats have had a few encounters of Type D killer whales there. So we were thinking, if we're going to find them, we might want to check out that area. That whole shelf edge is a spot where they've been seen, though. And beating our way out there in 25, 30 knots of wind, we had to take refuge behind Isla Diego Ramirez, because all of a sudden it started blowing 35, 40. There's blowing spray, and we actually couldn't stay there because it got so windy and the seas got so big that there was no point just trying to even find refuge there. So we set sail in the middle of the night, and we sailed backwards around Cape Horn in about 40, 45 knots of wind.
Wow.
We just had a little sliver of sail up, and we were doing 14 knots downwind, just running for our lives. And when we got back to the safety of the closest anchorage of the next day, we sat there for 8 days straight while it blew storm and hurricane force winds. And we just sat there thinking we're never going to get back out there. And after 8 days, we had this tiny little weather window, and we beat our way out there with our bow right into 3-4 meters, 25-30 knots, because we knew that was about as good as it was going to get. And we beat our way out there. We got out there at about 5:30 a.m. I got up because I did the math, and I knew that we were going to be on the spot about 5:30. And I got up, and Bob was already up there, and so was the captain. And then Captain Ben, he just said, "What's that?" And I looked out the window, and about 200 meters off the starboard bow, I held up my binoculars, and type D killer whales. They're right there. we could only see about 400 or 500 meters in the conditions. I mean, they weren't great, but these whales were right there.
Amazing.
That is incredible. Yeah. So before we go too far into it, I mean, they're rarely seen. Tell us about who are they? Who are type Ds? Where are they found? How rare is it to see them?
Sure. Yeah. So, okay, I guess it's best to start in the 1950s when, there was some killer whales that stranded in New Zealand, and there was a few photos taken, and it wasn't for many years until anyone thought much about how different they looked from any other known killer whale. And that person happened to be Bob Pittman, and someone who's spent a lot of time researching killer whales around Antarctica and just being interested in a lot of odontocetes and seabirds and fish and a number of other things, having spent so much time on the water. And so, he knew about this stranding and how unique these whales looked. And then some of the folks from the Crozet Islands who were collecting data on cetaceans in that region, in particular in regards to depredation, because there's a Patagonian toothfish longline fishery around the Crozet Islands. And some of the fisheries observers there had photographed these same animals. And they showed, Christophe Brunet showed some of these photos to Bob, and he said, "That's those whales, that stranded in New Zealand." And then over the next few years, with the onset of digital photography and Antarctic tourism, more and more encounters started coming out. And my first time down in Antarctica was 2009, 2010, and I had recently bought this Marine Mammals of the World Comprehensive Guide to Identification, which was published in 2008. And there's a little section in there about these strange-looking killer whales, but it said there was not much known about them. And so, just on one of the last trips that I had made down to the peninsula, or from southern South America down to the Antarctic Peninsula and back, we had a sighting of these killer whales, and we managed to get just a few photographs. And I was on board. I was a marine mammal lecturer for that half season. I think we did a few trips back and forth, and I was thrilled having actually just laid eyes on these whales. So I sent the photos to Bob, and it happened to be only the 6th confirmed sighting outside of Crozet of this killer whale. And it's just really interesting to make those observations. And that's all we could ever really hope to do, is continue just collecting photos and behavioral anecdotes from people who'd seen them. And so, Bob, also just having spent so much time sailing in those waters, and having not seen them himself, was very dedicated and motivated to try and lay eyes on them and doing what he does best to try and get some biopsy samples so that we could, for the first time, look at how they compare to all the other killer whales in the Southern Hemisphere. And
they do, they are unique looking. They do look very different from the killer whales up here.
Absolutely. Yeah, they've got these really blunt foreheads. They've got these little teeny weeny eye patches. Some whales just have basically just a little sliver, or even not much of an eye patch at all. And their dorsal fins are all somewhat pretty similar. They're very pointy and back swept. And unlike a lot of high latitude Southern Hemisphere killer whales, they don't have any dorsal cape at all. So they're very distinct morphologically from any other killer whale on the planet, especially those that they're sympatric with, the type A's, the type B's, and the type C's.
Fascinating. And we'll post some photos in the show notes for people to look at so they can see, and they can also look up the paper and search, I'm sure, for type D's as well, just to see these whales because they are so morphologically different. But you guys eventually got out there and found these whales, and tell us about the encounter itself that you had.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd be amiss if I didn't mention that, in 2017, Bob and I tried to find them as well, going down on a trip for 3 weeks. And, and it turns out that same vessel that we've been on found them on the next trip after we went home.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So that was brutal. So in 2019, we were pretty motivated, but, Bob and his wife, Lisa, had put together a really great team. I feel fortunate that they asked me to come. I mean, I was thrilled, and, there was, Beck Wallard from Australia and John Totterdell from Australia, Mariano Cerrone from Argentina. And then the captain and the crew of the vessel that we chartered. So when we found them, it was one of those wild moments where all of a sudden they were there, and then we just went full panic stations. It was also extremely early, and everybody was not feeling great. I mean, we'd been through probably the worst night of our lives to get out there. So people were kind of in that weird situation, and you might not know if you've never been there before, but it's somewhere between like half alive and half dead.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And so we stormed through the boat yelling type D. That got everybody feeling a little bit more than half alive. We grabbed our gear, cameras, warm clothes, crossbows, and we got out on deck. And when we got out on deck, they were all around us. I mean, they were just totally interested in what we were doing in their home. And they, maybe they'd never even seen a sailboat before. Those waters are not the kind of place that most sane people go in small boats for recreational or other purposes. So, there was a lot of them. With the data collected from the toothfish fishermen in that area that thankfully we've been collecting now for a few years, there's just under 30 in that group. And I've been going through all those photos and naming them all. And that was the same group we saw. We figured it was about 25 to 30. Going through all the photo ID data later, I ID'd 27 of them. And I think there's 29 in the group. So there could have been a couple animals we didn't photograph or, might have died at some point prior to us seeing them. So, they were, we couldn't tell exactly what they were doing. I mean, it wasn't super clear, other than that they were kind of interested in what we were all about. Beck, being an acoustician, she dropped this really cool custom-made hydrophone in the water, decorated with GoPros, and we towed that behind the boat. And as soon as that line was in the water, I mean, those whales had kind of lost a bit of interest in us, and they were popping up about 200, 300 meters away after a long dive. And that's where they were currently. This apparatus went into the water, and within 3 minutes, they were all back off the stern of the boat, swimming around it.
Wow.
They were like, and this might be what you kind of expect from a group of killer whales who makes part of their living by stealing fish and fishermen.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. So they were really interested in that line, and because it was decorated with GoPros, that got some amazing underwater footage of them close up of their faces, and they were all traveling in one big group. And so we spent just, I'd say 2 to 3 hours with them, and managed to get a few biopsies. Bob got a couple biopsies. The first one was D90, and then I biopsied D92, and then we got a third one that I'm not sure we photographed too well, so it's kind of hard to tell who it was. But with 3 samples in hand. We also had a bit of an extension on our weather window. And we just thought, well, if we're ever going to get to Antarctica, this is the time. So we got to get out of here. And we basically set sail for the peninsula, which was going to take us a couple of days to get to through the open seas, because we still had 3 weeks left after that. It was a 6-week journey. And we went down to Antarctica and did some work with type A's and type B's after the D's.
And was that was your only encounter with the type Ds on that journey? Is that correct?
Certainly hope to find them on the way back. And we went back to the same area, but they weren't there.
Well, I also wanted to add, it's a good thing that they can distinguish between Patagonia toothfish and GoPros.
I know. I think they were trying to. They were like, these aren't fish.
Well, so you guys collected a few samples, and I went through and read the paper that just came out, that study led by Andrew Foote. The type D killer whale genomes reveal long-term small population size and low genetic diversity. Just mouthful there, but an amazing paper to read, probably way above my level of understanding, because I'm not well, I've had a cold, and I also not up on all the methodologies. So, but really interesting to read, and highly recommend other people check it out as well. But tell us about the samples, what the study revealed, and there were some interesting things that came out of it.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I'm no geneticist either. I mean, especially when it comes to Andy Foote, his methodologies, and the insights that his work provides into our understanding of killer whales and their evolutionary history, and it's simply amazing. I can't follow along when it comes to describing how he comes up with the answers he does, but I take them at face value, and it's amazing just reading the results of this kind of work. Yeah, so you're right. There's low genetic diversity, and it looks like like a lot of other killer whales, that type Ds went through a severe population bottleneck at some point. And when you're looking through a lot of photo ID data of these animals from different oceans, and you can kind of see that this might be the case, because they're really all morphologically quite similar. Even the adult males and adult females, there's not a lot of difference in saddle patch shape or dorsal fin shape. You look at other populations of killer whales by comparison. Type A's are a good example, or even Big's killer whales, and you get this wide variety of saddle patch shapes and dorsal fin shapes. And it may be because these populations are just more naturally panmictic. They might just be open to mating with other killer whales that from different regions all across the board. I think those populations of type A are probably naturally a lot larger and more widespread, maybe a bit more versatile, being generalist predators, and so that predisposes them to higher genetic diversity. Type Ds, on the other hand, we don't know a lot about their life history traits, but we do know that they love to eat fish, and that other marine mammals will occasionally travel with them from time to time, which indicates that they are a dietary specialist, just like our resident killer whales here in the Pacific Northwest. And so if you think about that over, the long term, and that might have had something to do with why they've become so prone to mating within their own small group of individuals. Nevertheless, they've still managed to figure out a way to become quite widespread and perhaps even abundant compared to other inbred populations.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things I saw in the paper was looking at where that bottleneck potentially occurred in time, right? So the type D, it seemed like it was pre-Anthropocene. So when we think of southern residents or even the Scottish killer whales that have experienced this bottleneck due to human causes, most likely, it seems like potentially the type D experiences bottleneck before that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they in that sense, they've had a lot longer to figure out how to deal with this inherent problem. And for them, maybe it's not even a problem at all. I mean, we don't really know enough yet to know, and that's probably a good thing. We do know that some of the killer whale populations we know the most about happen to be the ones that are most affected by human impacts and the ones at the most risk of extinction. Type Ds may be inbred, but they're widespread, and there seems to be a lot of them out there. So, they've had a long time to figure out how to make it work for them. And, I can't help but find it interesting that, the 3 individuals who we biopsied were related. That's something that we thought was probably going to be the case. But the 2 of them were full siblings. We don't know that 100%, but it is stated in the paper that it's quite likely. And full siblings in killer whale societies are not common. That indicates that, it's a mother breeding with the same male over and over again. And if you think about a mating system like that, then that could very easily predispose a population to become inbred. It may have been a force driving it, or it may have been a result of it happening in the first place. But in any case, the paper didn't get into it too much, but I can't help but think about that when I look at these results, because they are very unique.
Yeah, very fascinating. Definitely, it sparks more questions.
Absolutely, because it's like you said, they have found a way to make it work, and maybe it's not a problem for them. It's just interesting to think about, because we would automatically assume, well, this is going to be a big problem, but they're, like you said, they're widespread. They seem to be making this work for them.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. I mean, they're still out there, and we just don't know a lot, other than that they love stealing fish from fishermen,
and they're good at it.
Yeah. They're good at it. Yeah.
Well, at the end of 2022, and I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, it seemed like right as this, from what I heard, right as this kind of study was wrapping up, there was another stranding of a type D in Chile.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that the samples from that will kind of provide some more insight. Should provide some more insight. But the samples from Chile versus the ones you guys collected versus the skulls from New Zealand, what could we look for, or what will be looked for in that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that is the question, really. It is, what to do with that sample. I think the first thing that Andy and his team will probably do are run it through the same kind of analyses as these other samples, just to see how they compare. I mean, it's quite likely that they're going to show the same kind of results, but if they don't, then they'll broaden our insights of this population. I think one of the main things that's really nice about that stranding, from a human perspective at least, is that it provides a potential type specimen. The animals that stranded in New Zealand, thankfully a museum collected a couple of the skulls, and they were able to get genetic data from those skulls by drilling out the hard part of the skull, and you can get DNA that way. And they did some years ago, and that's part of this study as well, as comparing the biopsy samples they collected to the individuals in New Zealand and finding they're very similar genetically. But in this case, there's an entire specimen, and it's fresh. So looking at that, unfortunately, it was too far gone by the time it was collected to look at stomach contents. But as far as genetic data goes, there's certainly lots there to use. And also, I'm not sure exactly who is doing it, but there will be a specimen there as well for someone if they want to use that in making a case for type D as its own species. Yeah,
I mean, they might be the first killer whale ecotype that actually gets classified as their own species.
They may be. There could be some others before them, depending on how long it takes. Yeah. I think we could make a good case for bigs and residents being different species, and there's certainly a geneticist has made the case for some of the southern hemisphere types being split as well, and. Yeah, so we leave it in their capable hands and see what happens. Because I think a lot of the ecological data has been there for so long. I mean, we've known since the 80s and 90s how distinct behaviorally and culturally and even morphologically they are in some cases. But really, it's kind of up to the geneticists to add their data in at this point too.
Yes, and we are very appreciative of all their hard work because definitely couldn't do it without them.
Absolutely. It's fascinating information.
All right. So one of the things we noted about type Ds is their strange appearance. And could that be a result of this like long-term inbreeding, small population size? What are your thoughts on that, Jared?
Yeah, it probably has something to do with it to some extent. I mean, it's really difficult to say for sure, but inbreeding does affect morphology. This whole blunt forehead thing, though, I tend to think is probably better explained by their evolution. Based on it's more of an ecological trait. Is what I'm trying to say. And I think that simply because when I worked in the South Atlantic, I was able to put a tag on one of these type B killer whales, and they're also known for having very blunt rostrums. And that whale dove deeper than anyone thought a killer whale could ever dive. We just simply didn't think that this species could dive over a kilometer and come back up to the surface again within 12 minutes.
Wow.
Right. I remember reading about that and was like just blown away.
Yeah. And so, no other killer whale that's been tagged, type A's or residents or transients has really come close to that. And none of those whales have blunt foreheads. However, we know that all beaked whales are deep divers. They all have blunt foreheads.
Yeah.
Sperm whales do. And so with type Ds having the bluntest forehead of all the killer whales, and also living in these very deep pelagic offshore environments, feeding on fish, which don't spend a lot of time in the mid-water column throughout the southern hemisphere. And it may be that type Ds also feed on squid and things as well. But I tend to think they're probably deep divers, and that that blunt forehead may have something to do with that. That's just my personal thoughts. I'd love to see more research done around that topic and how that might benefit the diving capacity and abilities of those species. But I don't know much about it, and I don't know if anybody does at this point.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I didn't even think about the comparison to like beaked whales and sperm whales and that, and I should have. But
it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that either, but it totally makes sense.
Well, really quickly, and feel free to just say pass if you want. But late last month, there was another paper published about the southern residents and how inbreeding depression can explain killer whale population dynamics. So those researchers kind of focused on southern residents, eastern North Pacific, so not type D, and very different habitat, morphology, etc. But is there anything you think maybe we can compare and contrast or take from it, the type D study?
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting timing too, that both these papers focused on inbreeding in killer whales were published around the same time, and I think that's an important an important aspect, because even though they both talk about these populations of killer whales which are quite inbred, those populations are so different, and the actual messaging behind the papers is also probably quite a bit different. I mean, having gone through a lot of photo ID data on type D killer whales, I know they're more abundant in southern residents, and being inbred for much longer, it's quite likely that they're faring better. This kind of landmark paper by Cardos et al., which I've only read the abstract of at this point. It's published in one of the best journals in the world when it comes to this kind of stuff. But I can't help but come away from reading the abstract feeling a bit depressed. Whereas I read the type D one and I don't feel that way at all. I just feel like it's fascinating and that these whales have made it work. So if anyone else feels depressed after reading that paper in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution about inbreeding in southern residents, I think the important message, if I was ever to have one around it, is simply that there's so much we can do to help these whales. And just because they're inbreeding, it doesn't mean we should give up. I mean, we can focus more and double down on other things like, making sure they have enough fish to eat, and making sure their waters are clean and healthy. And they'll figure it out if we let them,
Yeah, they're resilient creatures.
They're resilient. They're smart.
Have to get out of their way, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, there's so much we don't know, but the thing that we know the most is we just need to get out of their way and restore their food supply, and they'll do the work.
Yeah, and they can. I mean, killer whales, just like people, they probably experience, intergenerational trauma, and that might be part of the southern resident killer whale story, having, so many members of the community taken into the captive industry back in the 1960s and 70s. But, over time, that those wounds can heal. They can learn to be functional again by looking after each other. I mean, they just, there might be some time there where they have to relearn how to look after each other and how to, find their food and do all the things that functional killer whale populations do. But yeah, if we can just provide the habitat for them and give them some time, there might be some hope.
Absolutely. I think that if any species has proven resilient and the ability to adapt, I think that is definitely killer whales.
I agree.
So, Jared, we really appreciate you joining us. Before we depart, you're getting ready to leave on a field season. What's coming up here?
Oh gosh, it's a busy time. I mean, we're working on a few really interesting projects here, that we can't tear ourselves away from. But at the same time, we've got 6 weeks in Haida Gwaii coming up, where we're going to be on the water almost every day. So thankfully, I've got a great team. We're going to be, dividing and conquering, making sure that there's always some of us working on the projects while others are out in the field, and then switching on and off as weather allows. So yeah, 6 weeks in Haida Gwaii, we're going to be, working in the Merlin, our research vessel, on the west side as much as possible. And we'll be working up on the north coast and also the east coast as well, depending on weather, looking for all the rarest and most wonderful of cetaceans that Western Canada has to offer. If we can find another right whale, we'll be pretty happy. One of the most critically endangered whale populations in the world. But there's also a lot of other species at risk up there that we have a keen interest in, not only from Bay Cetology, but also especially from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And so we'll be keeping our eyes out for blues, fays, fins, and all kinds of killer whales. We've got at least 4 different populations of, at least 5 different killer whale populations that turn up in that area from time to time. So fingers crossed.
Well, good luck. Can't wait to hear how it goes.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back on and get some updates. It sounds like an incredible journey ahead.
I mean, I'll be honest, when we started this podcast, we're like, yes, definitely want to get Jared Towers on here, and we want to talk about all these amazing things that you've done and seen. So there's so many topics we could have you on to talk about, but you've got
anytime
a lot of work to do. So
we can chat more, and as long as we have a successful trip up in Haida Gwaii, I'll have more for you. I'll have more for you regardless. But
that sounds great, Jared. We really, really appreciate you coming on and spending some time with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you both. I appreciate it too.
So that was a great discussion. It's great having him on.
Yeah, I'm a little bit like meeting a celebrity.
He's a
For
rock
me, it was
star.
like, yeah.
I mean, he's been around killer whales his whole life. I mean, he's done so much around them and knows so much, and he's traveled all over the world, and he's seen type Ds.
I know, crazy.
I mean, I would love to see type Ds, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to happen.
Oh, you never know.
You never know, but I don't know how often I'm going to go hanging out in the roaring 40s and furious 50s.
That's true. for it.
Well, before we depart and the episode, we are running trips every day now, and so we have to clue everybody in on our recent sightings, and there's a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned one while we were talking to Jared, though I think it might have been before we hit record, but that group of 32 bigs in Boundary last week.
Yeah, so we've been getting bigs, killer whales almost every tour. I think 21 out of 25 or 21 out of 24 tours in March. And so far it's early, but we're batting 100%
On our 3 days in April.
on our 5 days.
Oh, okay, 5
in April. But not just a lot of bigs, big groups of them.
Yeah. Well, we have the amazing herring spawn going on up north, and if you guys haven't seen photos of that, like, definitely check that out because it's been drawing a lot of life up there in the northern Strait of Georgia and further north. But yeah, we're seeing these huge groups of bigs, and it's just been incredible. We have some familiar favorites that have shown back up over the last week and a half, 2 weeks. The T65As.
T65As are back,
and
not with A5 though. A5
he's been with 124C.
Yeah,
cruising around.
The continuing saga of 65 A5.
Yep, and then Big Brother just showed up a couple days ago.
Yeah, T65A's big brother, T63 chainsaw.
So he does, show up this time of year. It's funny because we were talking about, like, people ask frequently, like, oh, do you see the same whales all year round? Well, we see the same type of whales, bigs, killer whales we'll see throughout the year. But there are families that kind of have almost like a calendar, like T65As usually show up the last week of March, first week of April. Chainsaw and Mom usually show up right around this time, and we'll see them for a couple of days, and then it's like, well, see you next year.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with that, we talk about the T65As quite a bit. So T65A's mom is T65, and she spends a lot of time up in northern BC and southeast Alaska with her son, T63.
Presumably, but yeah.
Right, presumably.
Based on long-term close association. So T63, if you're wondering, he was not seen as a newborn calf like with her. So we can't be 100% for sure that he's her son, as far as I know. But presumed son.
Right, based on how they work socially.
Yep.
And we'll post some photos in the show notes of T63, and you'll understand why he is chainsaw. And Sarah finally got to spend some time viewing him after years. I mean, he is, even though he's on this somewhat regular calendar, it doesn't mean it's easy to go see him, because you're still talking about a big region down here, and you still have to have it timed right.
Weather has to be good.
Right. And so Sarah, like, I've gotten to see him the last few years, but you haven't. It's been years for you since you've seen him.
Yeah, the last time was, I think, it was 2021, I think, because the border was still closed with Canada, and we went all the way up into the Strait of Georgia on Imagine. So it was a long trek up there. And he was like a few miles over the border, so you could kind of see him coming up. And I was super excited. And then he never came over, and we had to go home. That was my last time seeing him.
Yeah, that's
until now.
Well, and he's so iconic that when word spreads that Chainsaw has been seen, I mean,
It was in the news.
Yeah, it was in Canadian news and Seattle news, and it was like that a couple of years ago too. I mean, he makes headlines.
He does. What was fascinating to me, Jeff, and you were on the trip with me when we saw him, he was hanging out with T49A1 Noah. Noah is huge, like as big as Chainsaw.
Yeah, that was for me the coolest part of the encounter was seeing the two of them side by side, really close together the entire time, and they're both very, very big killer whales.
And I mean, he's a whale that I've seen grow up. Like, I didn't see him as newborn, but I, saw him as a young whale in his sprouting years. And man,
yeah,
he's a big boy now.
to me, I feel that he's one of the biggest killer whales that we see, and whether that's actually true or not, He maybe he's not, but he sure looks like it.
Yeah, and he's not one where like when a passenger says, well, what's the biggest killer whale that you see out here? I don't immediately think Noah. You know, I think Galliano, I think Rainey.
Right. You don't,
but I'm going to have to start thinking about Noah now.
Absolutely. So we had, that's T49A1 and almost all the rest of the T49As were there, except T49A2, Noah's younger brother,
Jude,
who was hanging out with his uncle C, T49C.
Yep. And they've been hanging out for a couple of weeks now.
They have been, and they were
at least,
and we saw them a lot together in the fall. So this is a 16-year-old male and hanging out with his 25-year-old uncle, and just the two of them and cruising around San Juan Islands. Really, really neat to see.
Yeah, you had a cool encounter with them in Lopez Sound the other day.
I did. They were just kind of doing circles. It was kind of a little bit of a rough weather day. Not the kind where we would cancel a trip, but it was the kind where like you're kind of limited where you wanted to go, and it's like you could do it in some areas if there were whales. And they just happened to be...
Come on, Jeff, it wasn't like Cape Horn. So
no, it was not. But what was really cool is these two whales were in like the nicest water. If I could have picked like, yeah, let's do the whale trip there. They just were doing circles. It was almost like they were circling a bay.
Yeah.
And it's not because they care about the weather
right
above the surface and the waves. I mean, these are animals that go into the roaring 40s, right? So,
yeah. So I have a question for you.
Yes.
I was not on the water that day.
Okay.
I was sick with a cold. Do you think that they kind of changed their course because J-Pod spent all day coming down San Juan Channel?
I don't think so, because they eventually ended up going out into Rosario.
Oh, interesting.
And they were pointing that way a few times, and then they doubled back.
Okay.
I think I don't know what they were doing.
They were just doing their own thing.
Well, for part of it, they definitely looked like they took a little bit of a nap and were, in a little resting line with the two of them.
Nice. All right.
But at one point they did, like early on, I think they grabbed something to eat, because we didn't really see it. It wasn't very flashy, but we did see a lot of birds coming in. I think they just were enjoying the scenery of Lopez Sound.
Nice. All right. Well, that's good.
But you mentioned J-Pod this is how fast things change on our tours. We were going to go get some very, very far off, like half-mile looks at J-Pod, because they were almost right out in front of the harbor. And as I was leaving the harbor, a report came in of killer whales coming through Thatcher Pass, and I was like, well, let's go see who that is. And it turned out to be 49A2 and Uncle C. But J-Pod went down San Juan Channel.
I mean, it literally took them all day.
All day. So for people that were viewing from shore, either on San Juan Island or on Lopez Island, they had it great, because they had like all day J-Pod.
Yeah.
And playful social J-Pod for the entire day.
Yeah, I was on the couch, fairly miserable because I'm kind of a weenie. But I saw them in Cattle Pass, and I was like, oh, I should get up and go down there. But I'm sure by the time it takes me, half an hour to get down there from my house, they would be gone.
Which normally that would be the case.
And
right?
they weren't. They stayed. They were there for like, what, 2 hours, I think, in Cattle Pass.
Yeah,
or
some of the videos that I saw were
amazing.
That people posted from shore were really incredible.
So check out, like, Monica posted a video on Orca Behavior Institute, so go check that one out. Just incredible.
Yeah, we didn't get to see them. We were with 49A2 and 49C. And then, so we did see the rest of the 49As further up north a couple of days ago, including the youngest.
The little kid.
The little kid with the underbite. Little underbite.
Like Charlie Chin, T1.
Yeah, so we're calling him or her Charlie.
I mean, in honor of Charlie Chin. Yeah. I think that's...
Yeah. Well, and that name works for whether it's a boy or girl.
So, but Jays are down in the Sound again today.
Yeah, down.
They've
down
been making the rounds. So they've been in the Sound and then up here and then up north. And so it seems like they're finding something.
Yeah, it's interesting. They've been around a lot over the winter and early spring. And over the last few years, this is about the time where they head out west and disappear until like July.
Yeah. So we'll see what they do this year. It'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting to see. We had that report of K's and L's in Monterey Bay a couple of weeks ago. I saw some photos of them with salmon on their heads. That was amazing to see. Good to see that they were finding fish down there. K45 was seen looking good. So it's all in all,
it's hopeful. I mean, it's like Jared was saying, if we can get out of their way and get some good salmon recovery going, restoring salmon spawning habitat.
Make sure that the ecosystem can support them.
Absolutely, especially Fraser River, Columbia River, get some habitat restoration going there and increase the salmon run, the wild salmon runs. That is going to go a long way for them to get out of whatever genetic inbreeding bottleneck they might be dealing with.
Yep. And if anybody's looking for, ways to help that, there are some great projects to support. The Klamath River dams in California are coming down. That's awesome. That's a big salmon bearing river. Whale Scout here, want to give a shout out to them. Yeah. They're doing a lot of habitat restoration regionally. And
we'll post a link to Whale Scout in our show notes.
And as always, we're looking to rewild rivers where there are obsolete dams, but we're still having to fight the government who wants to put up more dams. So there are some new dams that want to be put up in Washington. I will find some links for that to link into the show notes to, we could use public comments when the periods are open and just some more awareness on that, because it's kind of happening on the down low.
I like that term, rewild rivers.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So I think that pretty much.
Did we miss anybody? I don't think we did.
Oh, we always miss.
I'm sure.
But there's always next episode.
Yeah.
And that will be coming out in a couple of weeks. Not sure yet who we're going to have on. In the meantime, if you want to come out on the water with us, we're running trips every day, Sarah and I, with Maya's Legacy Whale Watching.
Yep.
We'll post a link to that in the show notes. If you have any questions about anything we talked about on this episode, or have questions about or ideas for future episodes, you can email us at afterthebreachpodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this a couple times, and I know we haven't made it happen yet, but I am collecting the questions that are coming in. We'd love to do like an FAQ or a listener questions episode where we're just talking about random things that you guys have questions about. So definitely email us with those questions or hit us up on Instagram or Facebook. We really do love hearing from you guys and answering those questions too. Let's sign off here, Jeff. It's been great having Jared on, talking about really cool killer whales. And then, of course, our cool killer whales here at home. But thanks, everybody, for tuning in tonight. We look forward to bringing you the next episode of After the Breach podcast. And have a great night. Stay safe out there.